The following program, Search the Scriptures, is brought to you by the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. Speakers are Keith Sharp and Trevor Campbell. We invite you to call or write the church to submit questions for the speakers to answer. We'll provide answers from the Bible to your questions.
Trevor, we have a really good question this evening. What is the mark of the beast? Are you going to tell us exactly what that is? No question?
I'll try to narrow it down a little bit.
Okay. Good evening. I'm Keith Sharp. I preach at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ. And with me is Trevor Campbell. I'm going to let him introduce himself in the church in Payette.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, my name is Trevor Campbell, and I worship and I preach over at the congregation in Payette, the Church of Christ. We're located on Highway 62 in Payette, right next to the tractor dealership. And you'll see our meeting times on the screen there. We meet on Sunday mornings for a worship service. You can join us for that. And we have our phone number. That's actually my phone number on the screen there. You can call that if you have a question about the church that meets there, 870-435-2737. And you can also use that number if you have a question for me for the program that you'd like to have answered on this program. So if you're in the area of Marion County, come on out and join us for worship. We'd love to have you.
Thank you, Trevor. And of course, I'm Keith Sharp, and I preach at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ. In Mountain Home. We're 1 mile south of the Highway 62 412 bypass on the way down to Salesville. And you're going down, you're going past Good Samaritan, and then we're on the left. We're during the pandemic. On Sunday, we only have one service. That's at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. We ask people to wear a mask and socially distance, and we can bump elbows rather than shaking hands. But we're trying to make sure nobody catches the COVID-19. Then we also meet on Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock, and you're invited to that Bible study Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock. We have a ladies' class that meets at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning. Very fine ladies' class, and you ladies would do well to come to that and have good Bible studies with them. So remember those services of the Highway 5 South Church of Christ, and you're invited to attend. And we also, of course, invite your questions for this program. That generates the subject matter of this program. We try to give a Bible answer, not our opinions, but what the Bible says concerning the questions that you have. If you want to ask me a question, then you can call me at 870-321-5746. Or you can email me at keithsharp@suddenlink.net, or you can write to Post Office Box 263 in Mountain Home, 72654. We would be delighted to hear from you, receive your question, to give it an answer from the Bible on the air. Well, Trevor, our question is, what is the mark of the beast? Yeah. So I'm going to let you give your very erudite answer to that question.
Well, it is a good question, and there's a lot of thoughts surrounding the idea of the mark of the beast. But I want to start out in Revelation chapter 1 and look at the first verse of Revelation, because I think it's a key passage when we start to study the book of Revelation to keep in mind. The first verse says, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place, and he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John." And the thing I want us to kind of key in on is the part where he says that he signified it. He sent his angel and he signified it by his angel. And that term, signified, is a reference to the fact that the things given to John were given in a figurative language. And so things throughout the book are symbolic and figurative. And unless we, in the immediate context, see something that demands otherwise, that we take it literally in the immediate context, we have to look at the book as figurative. And so that's very important to remember as we go through and as we talk about things like the mark of the beast. But something else that I'd like to start out with, Keith, is there's actually, the mark of the beast is the mark that most people are familiar with and think of in the book of Revelation. But it's not the only marking in the book. There's also the mark of God. So there's two markings, the mark of God and the mark of the beast. And the mark of the beast is the one people tune into for the most part, and they kind of forget about the other one. But I think essentially what we're going to see here, and what's going to be most applicable to you and I today, is the fact that God knows who his people are, and he knows who the people that are not his. That is, those who are against him. And so in the book you have two markings. You have God's people who are marked, and you have the mark of the beast. And essentially the application I think today, as we'll see later, is that, you know, those are the individuals that serve their own desires and serve themselves. And today, those that do not want to do God's will, they would essentially fall under that mark of the beast category, if you will. But in Revelation chapter 7, we see that God's people are also marked. In chapter 7 and verse 1, it says, "After these things I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth or the sea, or on the sea, or on any tree. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels, to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, Do not harm the earth and the sea, or the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads." Now he's going to talk more about this later on in chapter 14, in verse 1 actually, of Revelation 14. But here, God's servants are sealed, and we're going to see later they have a marking on their foreheads. And so everybody's marked in the book of Revelation, whether good or bad, good or evil. And so in this case, before we even get to the mark of the beast, God is already talking about marking His servants. And it reminds me of a passage in 2 Timothy chapter 2. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, and in verse 19, where Paul tells Timothy, "Nevertheless, the solid foundation of God stands, having this seal, the Lord knows those that are His." And so God knows His people, and He knows those who are against Him. And that's something to keep in mind. And as we go through the book, as we look at the mark of the beast, that is, in Revelation, that's going to be, I think, the most applicable thing to you and I today, is to understand that God knows His people. He also understands those who are against Him. All right, Keith, I'll kick it back to you for right now.
All right, Trevor, excellent introduction to the answer to the question. And as always, I appreciate so much that Trevor goes back and shows the background and looks at the Scriptures themselves and shows you what the Scriptures themselves say. And everything he said was not only good, but applicable to the question. And I appreciate that a whole lot. I'm going to look at some of the passages and let Trevor look at what ones he wants to, where the actual term mark of the beast is mentioned. And it's found only in the book of Revelation, as far as I know, as far as that phrase, the mark of the beast. It's first found in Revelation chapter 13. And in the context of this phrase, mark of the beast, there are 2 beasts that are mentioned. In Revelation chapter 13, verse 1, he says, "Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority." Now, this beast, the characteristics of the beast here, are characteristics that are taken from Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel had prophesied of 4 kingdoms which were to rise. One was the kingdom that was in existence at the time that Daniel was writing. And these, one of them was like a lion, one was like a bear, one was like a leopard, and then there arose a kingdom which is a fearsome beast, unlike any other. And you can read about that in Daniel chapter 7. And of course, those kingdoms, if you just take them in historical order, from the day of Daniel, the one that was represented by the lion would be the Babylonian kingdom. And then the one represented by the bear would be the Persian or the Medo-Persian kingdom. And then the one represented by the leopard, which was fierce and swift, was the Grecian or the Macedonian kingdom, Alexander the Great, and those leaders who followed him. And then the Roman kingdom would be that great fierce beast like any other that stamped all flesh, meaning it crushed flesh. And so there were 4 kingdoms that Daniel prophesied that were yet to come. And of course, all of those fulfilled. And that's a mark of the inspiration of the prophet Daniel, that he could foretell the nations that were to arise after him, beginning with one that was in power at the time that he was writing. And then you go down to Revelation chapter 13, and these same beasts appear. There's a leopard, there's a bear, there's a lion, and the dragon gave authority to this beast that had these characteristics. So here's a beast that has the characteristics of these other kingdoms that had arisen before it. And we know what the dragon is from back in Revelation chapter 12. That dragon is specifically identified as Satan in Revelation chapter 12. And so this kingdom that arises, that has the characteristics of the ancient kingdoms of old, they were all pagan, and they were all fierce, and they all conquered much flesh. They received their power from Satan, just as the kingdom at this time received its power from Satan. Now, in that context, there's another beast that arises from the earth. And that's in Revelation chapter 13. I'm going to begin reading in verse 11. Maybe we'll get through all of this evening, and maybe not. And I want to comment a little bit, and then I'm going to stop and let Trevor make some comments also. He said, I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb. Well, of course, the lamb, back in Revelation chapter 4, is Jesus Christ. He's the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And this is like, there's a religious character, and he can deceive people. And he spoke like a dragon. That is, what he said was from Satan, not from the lamb. So he could deceive people into thinking that he's the Lamb of God, when actually he's speaking for Satan rather than the Lamb of God. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast. Well, that first beast is this great kingdom that came up, that had the characteristics of all these old pagan kingdoms. Came up out of the sea. One is the beast from the sea. This is the beast from the earth. He exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Well, there was a Roman Caesar named Nero, who was assassinated, and there was a myth that arose in the first century that he had come back to life. It was just a myth, but this would tie in with what we're reading here. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And by the way, there's been false prophets along who do false signs, and this is what this one is doing. He deceives those who dwell on the earth. In the book of Revelation, those who dwell on the earth are those who do not believe in Jesus Christ. They're the earth dwellers. And that's all they're assigned for, is this earth. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by these signs, or those signs which were granted him to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth, that is, the unbelievers, to make an image, that is, to worship idols, to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. One of the false things that were being done by the pagans at that time, they would make an idol. And within this idol, they would have a hollowed out place that the priest of the idol could sit or stand. And when somebody inquired of the idol would appear to speak. It would, of course, could not speak. There was a person hidden inside that idol that made it appear to speak. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads. Now notice there's two marks, a mark on the right hand or on the forehead. I'll come back to that. That no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Now there's the mark of the beast. Here's wisdom, let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. We can come back to that 666 later on and talk about that. But back to what this mark was. There was a mark either in the right hand or in the forehead. Now I take that as meaning that the right hand was that which gives service to the beast. And that could be much more than what was required of pagans in order to have Roman citizenship and in order to trade in the marketplace in the Roman Empire and that is to make a little offering to Caesar. Whether they really believe that Caesar were God or not, if they would make a little offering to Caesar, a little offering of incense on the altar to Caesar as God, then they could trade in the marketplace. They had a mark in their hand. They were literally given a mark in their hands that would enable them to trade in the marketplace. Those that I believe that had the mark on the forehead, those that actually believed that, they may have been a minority. But whether the mark was in the right hand or on the forehead, they were giving homage to the beast, that is, to Caesar as God. And these were serving Satan, serving the dragon, rather than serving Christ. Well, I'm going to stop there, Trevor. That's be my remark as to, or comments to what it means. And Trevor may differ on that, and that's fine, because he has the right to come to his own conclusion. So I'm going to turn it back to Trevor now.
Well, I do differ just slightly, but some of it that you said I do agree with. And you know, here in the text, to give a little background of secular history for a moment, the Caesars at one point in history, and I don't recall which Caesar it was at the moment for sure, but what they believed is after the Caesars died that they became gods.
Right.
But at one point in history, one Caesar, from a worldly standpoint, was smart, if you will. He decided that he should be a god while he's still alive. Well, that makes sense from a very sinful point of view. So that became the standard. The Caesars were deified, and so they were gods on this earth to the Roman people and the Roman Empire. And what Keith said there, about this second beast that came up out of the earth, it does appear that it's some type of false prophet that rose up, and it's supporting the worship of the first beast, which was the beast from the sea, and that would be the emperors. One of the emperors, or the emperors at that time, they were the beast. And you'll notice in verse 3 and 4, he talks about that all the world marveled and followed after the beast in verse 3. And then in verse 4, he says they worshipped the beast. Well, the world that we're dealing with here is the Roman Empire, as Keith has already brought out. And then as you get down into the portion about the marking, the mark of the beast, we do have these individuals that have the mark, and they're able to buy and sell and trade and so forth, whereas those who do not have that mark cannot do so. And I see this just a little bit differently, than Keith does, just slightly. I think the marks are figurative. Both the mark that I mentioned earlier in chapter 7, the mark of God on people's foreheads, as well as the mark of the beast here on the right hand or on the forehead, I really just think it has to do with God knows who His people are, which has always been the case and always been true. But here in this specific example, I really think it is a figurative sense. And also the Christians were being persecuted at that time, and so it would have reference to persecution. The fact that they couldn't buy or sell, I don't know how literal that really was. It's just that times were tough for them in this time period. So that's what I think there. As far as getting into the mark of the beast, I'll probably turn it back to Keith. I don't know if he's ready for me to jump into the 666 and those things yet. But Keith, did you want to start that
Trevor,
off?
Good comments, Trevor. What I want to do after we finish our comments on what this specifically means is to there are applications to today. The book of Revelation is not just a dry, musty, dusty book that has no application to today. It does have.
Absolutely.
And I know Trevor knows that and teaches it that way. But no, I think I appreciate what you're saying, Trevor. So please go ahead in your comments.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll go a little further then. All right. So in verse 18, as Keith has already read, it says, "Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Well, then in the very next chapter, in verse 1, it says, "Then I looked, and behold, a lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written on their foreheads." And so this is what I kind of mentioned earlier on, is the fact that there's these two separate markings. You have God's people, and you have those that worship Caesar and go after the Roman Empire. Well, in verse 18, the book is figurative, and most of the numbers in the book are figurative. However, in this particular instance, I think the context does demand us to take this part a little more literal in verse 18. He says, "Here is wisdom." So he wants us to use some wisdom here, and wanted the people of that day to use wisdom. "Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast." And then he says the number is 666, and he says that it's a number of a man. Well, I know today, Keith, and you've probably heard this or seen this too, I know people that get really upset when they see the number 6 or several sixes together. I had a friend that got very upset because his paycheck was $666, I think is what it was. He was upset about that. I heard of another issue, these ladies, actually I was in a store and I overheard these ladies, they were right by me shopping, and the lady said her granddaughter was given the number 66 for her soccer jersey, and she was very upset about that. And so people get bent out of shape over it, but I really don't think it applies in the same way today, and I think we'll see that. I think the Bible makes it clear. Well, he tells us to use wisdom and to calculate this number, the number of the beast, he says, which is 666. Well, here I think we got to understand a little bit of secular history, and I'm relying on historians myself, okay, because I didn't live in the days of the Roman Empire. But from what I've been told through historians, they say that they would take people's names, including the Caesars, and they would give the name a numerical value. All right, and so I'm not going to get into the specifics of it, but basically the first so many letters of the Greek alphabet equaled this number, and the next so many letters equaled a different number. And what you do is add all these numbers together, and here was the number of the name of that person, had a numerical value. And so here, it's a little backwards. Instead of giving a name, and then we calculate the number, we're given the number, and we're supposed to calculate the name. Well, what's interesting is if you take the number 666 and you use this calculation, this is something you can look up on the internet, by the way. Both the Hebrews and the Greeks had a way of taking people's names and turning it into a numerical value. Well, you can take the number 666 and working backwards, you can actually look at several of the Caesars of this day, and their names come out to 666. And including, I believe, Titus was one of the Roman emperors during this time period. And Titus, his name in the Hebrew, his full official name, that is, comes out as 666. Nero is 666 in the Greek language. So it's just a calculation. So we're working backwards. And I think here it's not to be taken figurative, the 666, but more literal. He wants them to number who this person is. And they would have known at this time period what Caesar that he was talking about. Caesar is the beast that they're worshiping. All the world, he says, worships it. So that's one of the Caesars. So today, when we talk about 666, it really doesn't mean anything to us, unless you worship one of the Caesars, then that might apply. I don't know anybody that worships one of the old Caesars, but that's what it was actually referring to. It doesn't have anything to do with anybody today or worshiping anything specifically today, except, as we mentioned earlier, the application of it. God's people worship God. Those that worship self, they would fall under this other category. When I say worship self, going after our own desires, doing as we please, doing what we wish, not following God's will. But chapter 14 and verse 1 begins with those 144,000, and that is figurative, by the way. There's nothing in the context to demand that it's literal. And those individuals have their Father's name written on their foreheads. And I'm going to stop because I've been talking quite a while. Keith, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Trevor, you're doing a really good job, and I really appreciate your insight. Obviously shows that you've done some study.
Well, I hope the folks at home understand all that, understand what I was saying there. I don't know if that made sense or not.
They probably did, because I think I did.
Oh, good.
and so that probably means the folks at home understand it just fine as well. And I want to make 2 points from this. And one is that the specifics of what we're talking about here applied in the first century. But God's rule is always the same. God is the same. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8, which is specifically talking about Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The nature of God and the nature of God's rule is unchanging and unchangeable. He's the only being that never changes. So whatever kind of rule he did in the first century, he has the same kind of rule today. And ever since Jesus started the New Testament, on the day of Pentecost, 33 AD, recorded in Acts chapter 2, since the New Testament began, then God's rules for his people and God's rule for all people remain the same. So although there are specific things in the book of Revelation that have been fulfilled, the principles remain the same. And one of those principles, Trevor, I believe, very well stated when he went to 2 Timothy chapter 2, God knows those who are His. Yes, everyone who is His has, figuratively speaking, God's mark on their forehead. That is, we really believe in Jesus Christ, His Son, and we show that by our obedience to Him. God knows that. Other people may or may not know, but God knows. And I should know myself whether I belong to Him or not. We can know we're saved according to John in 1 John chapter 5, verse 13. So those who really believe and really obey have the mark of God on their forehead, figuratively, and in their hands, figuratively. They believe Him, they're doing His will. Those who worship false religion, whether it's the paganism of the first century, or whether it is the Judaistic traditions that were handed down and the Jews were trying to force on the Christians, particularly those Christians who were Jews. They have the mark of Satan, figuratively speaking, on their foreheads and on their hands. God knows who serves Him and God knows who does not. And we should know ourselves whether we're serving Christ or whether we're serving Satan. And there are other references to the mark of the beast in Revelation, and I have them written down here, but I believe would all be consistent with what Trevor and I have talked about to this point. Well, Trevor, we have about 2.5 minutes left in the program, and I've really said what I would like to say concerning the mark of the beast, and I think you've done a very good job talking about it. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, as far as application, I think it's very important that we consider how these things apply to us, and Keith's talked about it. I've already talked about it as well. But I do want to look at a passage in Hebrews chapter 4, and this doesn't have anything specifically to do with the mark of the beast, but I think when we're talking about applying these ideas of whether we belong to God or not, whether we're His or not, in Hebrews chapter 4, and in verse 12, the Hebrew writer says, "For the word of God is living and powerful, and it's sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of soul, and, and spirit, and of joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. And there is no creature hidden from His sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of Him to whom we must give account." And so, what we've been talking about in Revelation there is God knew who His people were. They were marked. And then you had those who had the mark of the beast, and they were not His people, certainly not. They were pagan worshipers. But God knows there's no creature, there's nothing hidden from His sight. All things are open to Him. We can fool a lot of people in our own personal lives. We can fool people into think that we're good people or godly people or religious, if you will. But God knows the truth. He knows whether or not. He knows our hearts. God knows the hearts of all men. In fact, when God sent Samuel to anoint King David in the Old Testament there, He sent Samuel to anoint him, and Samuel came, and Jesse's sons were all presented, except for David. He wasn't there at the time. Jesse's sons were set up before Samuel, and Samuel went to the oldest alive, and he said, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." And God said, "That's not him, that's not the one." God says, "Because I don't look," and I'm kind of paraphrasing, "but I don't look at the outward appearance of man, I look at the heart." And so we want to make sure that we're having honest hearts, doing God's will to the best that we can.
Very good, Trevor. We appreciate you watching the program this evening, and we hope this has been of benefit to you. If you have further questions about this, let us know, and we invite you to watch the program at the next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching Search the Scriptures. If you have a Bible question or comment, you may call 870-321-5746, email keithsharp@suddenlink.net, or write Keith Sharp at P.O. Box 263, Mountain Home, Arkansas 72654. And your question will be answered on the air. Be sure to watch next week at the same time for another edition of Search the Scriptures. Until then, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace.